who, I would say, basically supports the Israel answer, but he says these are very disturbing images we see from Gaza. So, if I understand you correctly, what Israel is doing right now is not actually destroying Hamas, but is making this monster even bigger. It's as if it puts not, other people will support Hamas because they see, because they see what Israel is doing. Is Israel at the moment acting against its own interest with this kind of warfare? I think so, and I think there are many Israelis who understand this, but they have no voice in the government. And I doubt seriously that their views are being heard by anyone in power. You're listening to the Netanyahu wing of Israeli politics that is out for blood and feels strongly that it has to administer this object lesson or Israel won't survive. As opposed to what I am suggesting, which is if you administer the object lesson, Israel will not survive. That's my argument. So, I've said to people that would listen here in Washington, every president at some point has intervened in these conflicts involving Israel. They've operated usually as a check on Israeli power. In other words, when the Israelis crossed the Suez Canal, we said no. After the counterattacks to break through the Egyptian lines, he said no, we don't want that. Pull back to the other side of the Suez. Then we got a ceasefire. And as a result, we got an agreement which was a very good agreement in the long run between Egypt and Israel. Right now, there is no check on Israeli power. There is no check on power from the United States being employed on Israel's behalf. I think a president today is really obligated to save Israel from itself if Israel is to survive. My great fear is that won't happen. The entire region will line up against it and nothing we do is going to save it at that point. You mentioned before the First World War. This is highly interesting, the long roads to the First World War, but I would say there was an interesting nuance or a difference that if you look at the politics in the beginning of the 20th century, my impression from what I've read is many of the superpowers of the day thought that they would actually prevail in this war and they could get something out of it. Everybody had some kind of interest in going into war and completely misjudging the situation. They thought at the end of it, we will win. Surely the Germans thought they would win, the British thought they would win, the French thought, together with the Russians, they would win. And isn't it so today that nobody wants a global war? Nobody wants to risk a global war, be it Russia, be it China, be it the United States, even though they seem to have a severe leadership problem in Washington at the moment. So isn't this common interest of the superpowers of today an argument that says we shouldn't panic at the moment, and the scenario of a World War III in the Middle East starting there is not so big? What do you say? Are you concerned that a third world war could emerge from this situation? Well, I haven't used the term World War III because I think that if we're exposed to even a fraction of what you're describing, people will be shocked and will reel back in fear of it. Now, the good news is that at least in Moscow with President Putin and certainly with President Xi in China, you're talking about two men who have been in political power for at least 20 years. That's a very important point. They're experienced. They also represent countries with long memories and long histories of conflict. That makes a difference. It's helpful because I can tell you that, if anything, everything that both of those men have done since this tragedy in Ukraine began has been to deliberately limit the fight. We have provoked the Russians repeatedly, and the Russians have steadily refused to take the bait. I'll be frank. I'm not worried about Moscow and Beijing. I'm worried about Washington, and here's why. We suffer from a terminal case of overweening arrogance. I think people used to talk about this before World War I as a complaint. Well, that was modest compared to what goes on in Washington. And you hear these people talk about the United States today as though it were 1991. And it isn't. We're not the same country. Our economy is fragile. Our financial system is, in my judgment, in ruins, poised for all sorts of crises. Then the population itself, we're dealing with the influx of millions of people that are not us. You have that in Europe, we have it here. We're trying to sort through this. So, we're not a cohesive society or nation as we once were. And in the midst of all of this, everyone seems to think that we are so powerful and so dominant that no one would contradict us and that anything we want to undertake will work, that our weapons, our capabilities are superior. You don't have any reasonable debate in public about the dangers involved. We have completely forgotten war. The last time we had a war that affected Americans was World War II, and remember the last time we had a really major war that killed 1 million of us was the Civil War. So you have a mentality here. It's a combination of arrogance, and I would also say ignorance. There's no understanding of the Middle East, just as there's no understanding of Eastern Europe. I've said several times, what are we doing in Ukraine? We don't know anything about Ukraine. We don't know anything about Russia. Now, certainly, some of us do, but the broader population doesn't. And again, they look at what's happening in Israel and say, well, it's these Arabs again. We just have to help them defeat these people. But it's not that simple. It's a much larger problem. And, by the way, there's this perception that everyone there, including Iran and Turkey, are backward. There's no appreciation for the professional competence of the Turkish armed forces or, for that matter, the Iranian armed forces. These people are, in fact, sophisticated. They have advanced air and space capabilities, advanced missile technology, and particularly the soldiers that serve in the Turkish army. They're ferocious fighters. They're very good soldiers. There's no sense of that. So I think that's the problem. Arrogance and ignorance in Washington, and then the feeling that this is Israel's moment to deal decisively with its opponents, to administer this important object lesson. Remember that throughout its history, the Israelis have always felt that if a single Jew in Israel is harmed, you must immediately strike back and crush the source where Jews will never be safe. Well, here we are, and we've done that. It hasn't worked very well, and now they think this is the time to strike the final blow. I would rather not see this progress to the point where everyone thinks it's the final blow. I'm sure you understand. That's extremely interesting what you're saying. I mean, this reminds me in a horrifying way about Serbia, where the Austrians thought, now we have to solve the Serbian problem, and the Germans have to help us, and they thought they would solve a local problem, and by solving this problem, which they didn't, they created a huge mess, and the First World War is something like that probable to happen now in the Middle East? The unhinged Israelis walking into Gaza, thinking, together with the Americans and the West, we are so strong, we can fight this down to the end, we can solve this problem for good, and, in the end, they reap a much stronger storm from other countries, and even the Russians and the Chinese could say, now is the time to teach the West the lesson. This arrogance has to stop, as they did with the Germans. They want to collectively punish the Americans and the arrogant Westerners, epitomized by the Israeli, and we end up in a third world war. How probable is the scenario like this? Well, it's not impossible. It's more probable than I would like to admit, and that's exactly what I've worried about. And, of course, we're not prepared for that. By the way, in 1914, only 40% of the Imperial German Army had field gray uniforms. So the Germans were not prepared for a major war either. And, of course, everybody thought the same thing. You'll all be home by the time the leaves fall. That was, of course, the Kaiser's announcement. You know, the truth is, man forgets. We forget repeatedly, and what I'm trying to point out is that the American memory is different from the European memory because our recollections of the past are shaped by fantasy in many cases. We think that we were better than we were, that we think we are greater than we are, and we refuse to accept the possibility that we're simply a great power. We may be strongest in many respects of the great powers, but we're just a great power. There are other great powers. That's a problem. And no politician wants to stand up and tell Americans the truth. They all want to stand up and say, we're the greatest people in the world. There's nothing. Listen to Biden. He's talking as though it's 1941. Lisa Graham. Yeah, I mean, it's absurd. People are out of touch with reality, and all this World War-style rhetoric is, I would say, falling on a lot of deaf ears. It's back to what I said at the beginning. Most Americans aren't really engaged anyway. This conversation is taking a turn which is probably too depressing for me to bear, so, therefore, I have to desperately find a beam of hope at this point of our discussion. Now I will offer a beam of hope to you, Colonel Macgregor. I've just read in the summer vacation. I've read, late enough, I read War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. And Leo Tolstoy's story offers a very interesting theory. He says the politicians, the Napoleons of this world, they are highly overestimated. What really matters is the collective will of the people. And you said something very interesting just before. I mean, you say a lot of interesting things, but something particularly interesting was when you said countries like Russia and China, they have a collective memory, and their memory tells them we went through humiliation. The Chinese were humiliated by the West. The Russians went through the hell of communism. These people, they have had enough. The Germans have had enough of war. Nobody wants this. Only the Americans, as you say, they're probably a bit too self-confident. But couldn't we argue that the collective will of the people, of the individuals, which has to be taken into account by the politicians, goes against the war? And with Tolstoy's story, we would say that as long as the people do not want war, there won't be a war. So the will of the people is more important than the madness of the politicians. What do you make of that? I think you're half right. The part that's wrong is the assumption that the leadership in Washington feels compelled to take into account the will of the people. They don't. That's the point. They've been allowed for decades to conduct foreign and defense policy in isolation from much public censure. In other words, no one has stood up and said, wait a minute. Look, we were in Vietnam for 10 years. Until finally, people said, that's enough. You had riots in the streets. The draft fell apart. That was 10 years. We're only at the beginning of many of these things. And again, it's back to how many Americans do you need to kill in one day to wake people up? I hear that question all the time. The politicians love air and naval power because it's sort of sex without responsibility. Once you put ground forces down, you're committed, you're accountable. But we can go back to the history of NATO and Helmut Schmidt, who made himself very unpopular at the time at the end of his tenure. But he said if the Americans are not on the ground here in Germany with their forces and their missiles, they will not be taken seriously, and neither will we. Well, he was right. We're trying to do everything from a distance. If that distance shrinks and we begin to do things on the ground, and Americans are killed, people will start to wake up and say, what are we doing? But thus far, that hasn't happened. And, of course, the press is very helpful because it doesn't report the truth. It doesn't tell the truth about the American losses that do occur. It's a huge problem. We've seldom had this in our history, but it's a new dimension of an old problem, which is most people, most of the time, don't pay attention to what happens overseas. They're much more worried about what's going on in St. Louis, Seattle, and other places and their income and inflation and accessibility to transportation, cars, gasoline. These things are important. What happens overseas, well, you know, that's overseas, and I don't care much that as long as I'm fine. Amen.